So how does so what am I saying here? Like, what does all of this have to do with anything? My point in saying all of this is that so from Manetho, okay, one thing I did forget to include in my previous video, Manetho gives us what we call the dynasties. We measure Egyptian history in terms of dynasties. Now, when we hear the word dynasty, we tend to think of like a family of rulers, and that's generally how the word is used. Manetho doesn't necessarily stick strictly to that. There are times when he switches dynasties based on major events that occur, not necessarily a change in the lineage of the rulership. But nonetheless, we basically construct our Egyptian chronologies today after Manetho's king list and his dynasty list. And there's, I think, 30 or 31 dynasties that make up Manetho's king list. And this covers basically all of Egyptian history until the time. I don't know exactly when the Persians took over and the Greeks took over. Egyptian history independently was finished in around 600 or so ish BC. I don't know when they stopped counting the dynasties exactly. I know, for example, the Ptolemies, which were the Grecian rulers of Egypt. I'm not sure if they fit in as a dynasty or if they're even after the dynasties. I don't know exactly. I'll look into that. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how we count those. But Egyptian history is basically broken up into these dynasties from number 1, starting with Menes, down to 30 or 31. And they are, and within that time period, and that comes entirely from Manetho. Like that's, we base our chronology today about Egypt entirely from that. And so, and in that time frame, and in that list of dynasties, there are these periods that we call the kingdom periods, and then the periods that we call the intermediate periods. So what's the difference? All right, so I mentioned earlier in one of my previous videos that Egypt was made up of at least two distinct, actually more than that, but there were at least two distinct areas that made up Egypt, and that was the north and the south. The north was lower in elevation, so it was Lower Egypt, and the south was higher in elevation, so it was Upper Egypt, because the Nile itself runs north, runs from its origin, I think, in Lake Victoria down Ethiopia or somewhere down there, and runs north to the Mediterranean Sea, so the elevation decreases as you go. In fact, Egypt itself is often called, in their native Egyptian writings, they often refer to the country as the Two Lands, because there were two distinct lands that made up Egypt, the north and the south. And the pharaoh was often called the pharaoh of the two lands, or the ruler of the two lands. And the periods in history in which there was a single pharaoh ruling over all of Egypt were called the kingdom periods. That's when there was one pharaoh who ruled from north to south all throughout the land of Egypt. There was an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a new kingdom. Of course, it's self-explanatory that if there are three separate kingdom periods, then clearly there have to be periods in between those kingdom periods that punctuate those kingdom periods. And in this case, and that's the period of time in which Egypt was not united under a single pharaoh all throughout the lands from north to south. There would have been at least two pharaohs, one in the north and one in the south, and possibly more. In some instances, there may have been 3 or 4 different pharaohs, 3 or 4 dynasties ruling at the same time. One of our flaws in our Egyptian chronology is that we really are not as certain as we'd like to pretend that we are about how successive these dynasties were or how concurrent they were. Okay, and that makes a huge difference to our timeline. What do I mean by that? Well, a successive dynasty means you have one dynasty followed by another, followed by another, followed by another, so on and so on down the line. If you have 31 dynasties and they're all successive, it means they just go straight down the list, 1 through 31, and they each follow the last, all the way down to the end. Okay? We know that wasn't the case because we know that some of the dynasties were concurrent. Like I said, there were times in Egypt's history when there was more than one pharaoh, thus meaning more than one dynasty. Each of these kingdom periods was separated by a period in time in which there was more than one pharaoh. Therefore, the kingdom was not united, so it wasn't a kingdom period. We call those the intermediate periods. We have the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, the second intermediate period, the Third Kingdom, and then a third intermediate period, the New Kingdom, I should say. Actually, I may have that slightly wrong. I'll check. I'll check the timelines. I actually, like I said, I don't have a lesson plan or a curriculum to follow here. I'm just sitting in front of the camera talking. So I'll go back and kind of take a look at to make sure I got this all right and correct myself if I need to in an upcoming video. But basically, you have the kingdom periods when Egypt is totally united under one pharaoh, and you have the intermediate periods when there are at least two pharaohs, or if not more, one in the north and one in the south, and the kingdom is not united. And then you have the times when they're actually conquered by foreigners, but we'll get to that later. And that would, we'll get to that later. And so part of our problem, chronology-wise, is that there are times when we cannot be certain when certain dynasties began or ended, or whether or not they were strictly concurrent, or to some degree overlapped, or strictly consecutive, I should say, one after the other, or to some degree overlapped and may have been concurrent. And that makes a big difference to our timing. Remember how I said earlier that we can date the Exodus to 1446 BC? Okay, so let's just keep that in our heads and think about this then. If we look at Egyptian history and we have a timeline going from 3000 BC or whatever it is down to the days of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, when Egypt was finally done for good, it was just a Roman getaway colony basically from that point forward. If we have this 3,000 year period of history that we call Egyptian history, and we have it dated so that we've got these 31 dynasties lined up on a timeline from start to finish where we think they fit in this 3,000 year period of history, okay, and we give them dates and we say, okay, this dynasty was from these years, this dynasty was in these years. Just as an example, if we think the 18th dynasty, which is part of the New Kingdom period, was in the 1400s BC, okay, then we should be looking for evidence of Moses during that period of time. And that's what some people do. They think the 18th dynasty was in control during the days of Moses, and so they look for evidence of Moses and the Israelites in the stuff associated with the 18th dynasty, and they don't find it. So then they wonder, well, where is it? Well, the Bible must have just made it all up then. Now they don't think to question themselves and they don't think to question their assumptions that Moses should fit in the 18th dynasty or the 19th dynasty, or exactly how you fit it in. And the reason why they don't do that is because they have constructed this timeline that shows them that 1400s BC is when the 18th dynasty was in control. Okay? Since they believe in their timelines, they don't question that. So then they look at the evidence for that time period and see if Moses fits in there. He doesn't. So then they just assume that Moses is made up. That didn't really happen. This is entirely, again, an assumption problem. We have assumed that our timelines of Egypt are correct. Even though we cannot be certain of this, we act as though we are. So we have our timeline, so we have identified who we think was king of Egypt, during the time period when Moses should have been there, when the Exodus should have been happening. We don't find any evidence of that happening in that time period of that king who we think was king at that time. So therefore, instead of questioning our own assumptions about whether or not that king was really king during that time, we then say, well, Moses is just made up and that's all just nonsense. Which is very strange, and as one of the interesting little rabbit holes to go down here, because we partly wrote this chronology of Egypt, this timeline of Egyptian history, was largely based on biblical data in the first place, which we then turn around and say, well, we don't actually believe any of that. If we were consistent with what we say about these things, we'd have to reconstruct our entire Egyptian timeline, because to a large degree it was built on synchronisms with the Bible. And so that is where I mentioned earlier, that is why I mentioned at the beginning of this video, at the beginning of this session, that our study of archaeology as an academic discipline is still fairly new, very new actually. You compare it to many other human disciplines, and it's extremely new. Only about 2 centuries old, and for at least half of that time, it was very unreliable and undisciplined, and really was a treasure hunter's game, with only a few serious scholars. Many of whom, by the way, in the early wave of archaeology, the first half of its history, were seriously studying this stuff in order to prove the Bible. When they first went to Egypt and these other lands to look for this stuff, they went there with the intent that they were going to find evidence establishing the Bible's accounts, basically, proving that it happened based on finding physical evidence still buried in the sands. They didn't find that. Actually, they did, but they didn't understand what they were looking at. So over the course of time, well, I'm actually getting ahead of myself. Because they were so eager to do that, several of their early discoveries were misinterpreted in light of biblical data because they were in a rush to confirm their discoveries according to the biblical data. Then later on, it became clear that we had developed an edifice that was not a structure that could not stand, a structure of timeline and history that was built on a foundation of sand and had to fall. But instead of letting it fall, we just gave up our belief, our quest to find the Bible in archaeology, and then we just gave up a belief in the Bible altogether. That's basically how the history of archaeology as an academic discipline occurred. In the 1800s, up to the beginning of the 1900s, men and some women were going out there to find evidence of the Bible's events buried in the sand. In their rush to do this, they made several leaps in logic and assumptions and came to some conclusions based on the biblical data, trying to match them up, that did not end up being correct. And then with that data, with those mistaken conclusions, those assumptions that they made that were based on matching up Egyptian history with the Bible, they constructed a timeline of Egyptian history that later on, decades later, they concluded was incompatible with the Bible, which is strange. So instead of questioning their assumptions about whether or not their Egyptian timeline was correct, they assumed it was correct, even though it was largely constructed with biblical data, and then discarded the Bible to disregard all that information, which of course if they're being consistent, they'd have to discard their own timeline because their timeline was largely constructed using biblical data. So anyway, it's really an interesting study in human hubris and how we make these pronouncements and these assumptions. If you really, if I'm saying something that offends some people here, okay, just look at what's happening around here today with COVID. We've made all kinds of assumptions and said all kinds of things about COVID that have proven not to be true. Okay, we spent more than a year disinfecting everything and wiping down everything, and we didn't need to do that. Okay, it's like we have known since April of 2020 that COVID wasn't spread through surface contact. And yet, it took almost a full year for our experts to officially update their guidelines saying that we don't need to do that and calling it just hygiene theater. And even then, we haven't stopped doing it. Even though the experts finally updated their guidelines a year after they should have and said that you don't need to do that anymore, we're still ignoring them and we're still doing it. Okay, one of the things I find so interesting is I go to the library a lot because I haven't actually been inside the library in more than a year. But in the last year, they've been quarantining the books. I put requests of the books for books of the library all the time. And it used to be I would do this and the books would come, assuming they were within the system. They didn't have to go look outside the system, which they usually don't. Usually. The books would come in a few days. Well, now they're quarantined. I got several books that I requested at the end. This is June 8th. I got several books that are just some regular fiction books, nothing special about them, that I requested at the end of May that I still haven't gotten because they're being quarantined somewhere 12 days later. We don't need to be doing this. We didn't used to do it. In the past, I would have gotten these books after like 2 or 3 days. Now it takes like 12 or 13. Not because we need to do this, because we want to do this. We want to keep quarantining these books even though there's no reason to whatsoever. And even the experts are saying we don't need to do this anymore. And they've been saying that since March. We've known this since last April. And yet, because we're so fixated on it, we keep doing it even though there's no reason to. There's no benefit from it. It's entirely vestigial. It's entirely theater. It's all in our minds. So we have seen clearly in the last year how we can form these assumptions and we can take these positions that we psychologically cling to, even if they're completely ineffective, objectively, scientifically, measurably, demonstrably ineffective. COVID has demonstrated this quite clearly. And this is a problem that affects all of academia, not just science, not just virologists or immunologists or whatever. There's a lot. I'm from academia. Okay, it's like I'm not from the scientific branch of academia, but I am from the historical literature branch of academia. It's like I'm telling you, this is a problem in academia. You get these. Okay, so first of all, again, archaeology as an academic discipline only has about 200 years of history. In the first 100 years of that time, it really was an every man for himself, free for all, who can get the most treasure, who can make the most discoveries. I mean, it really was. I'd say that way up until the early 1900s. So academia as a serious, controlled, measured academic discipline, or archaeology, I should say, has only been around about 100 years, which isn't really a very long time. And even and during that time, as it is the case with every other branch of academia, what happens is, if you get into this field to make a name for yourself, to get a PhD, to get credentialed, to pass peer review, to get your papers printed, to get your thesis accepted, to get your doctoral degree, to become an accepted member of the community, you pretty much have to take a stance, stake your claim to a position, submit that position to a board somewhere out there, like people, somewhere out there. They grant you, they say, okay, yes, we accept this position, we accept your work. They give you a doctorate, whatever form that takes. And now you're part of the community. That happens usually when you're around 40 years old. You spend the first 20 years of your life, from the time you go into college to the time you're in your 30s, basically preparing for your doctoral thesis, which you typically write in your 30s, usually get passed when you're about 40. And then you spend pretty much the rest of your career defending that position. Whatever you wrote in your doctoral thesis, that position pretty much is what makes you a doctor, what makes you an accepted scholar in the community. And then you pretty much spend the rest of your career in life defending that position. That's pretty much what it is. That's what it ultimately comes down to. So there is a huge vested interest, humanly, just speaking from the perspective of how humans behave, there is a huge vested interest in defending what has come before. Your positions are built on what other positions have been built on, and it's definitely within your interest to defend your position, and by consequence, whatever positions you have used to stake out your position. And during the course of time, what will happen is different groups of people who think similarly about certain things will stake out their little fiefdoms together and all kind of bunch together as a community. That's what they call it, a community. Okay? And we see this with every academic discipline. We're seeing this certainly in the scientific community with COVID, but it extends from there to everything. This is why I believe that, anyway, I'm going to get off track if I continue talking about that. But you pretty much have a situation where 100 plus years ago, a chronology of Egypt was developed using biblical data to help support key points of it. That chronology has since essentially proven to be untenable with actual data that we have gleaned from. And again, remember, we're not talking about a lot here. We're talking about tags and ratters. We're talking about just little threads of actual history. Unlike, say, with COVID, where we can actually put the virus in a lab and study it, okay, and even still walk away with different conclusions about what we have seen. We're not talking about something like that here. We're talking about something that is subjective by its very nature. We're talking about ruins. We're talking about bits and pieces of pots and pans falling on the ground, buried under mounds of dirt and sand for thousands of years. And we're trying to interpret how they got there. Okay? This is always going to be imprecise by nature. And when we have this position that we agree upon, we want to stick to that. We want that to be certain. Because in the end, we want to have faith in that position. We want to have faith in our Egyptian chronology. So when it gets challenged by unconventional views or other people suggesting different dates for different pharaohs or kings, we don't like that at all.